Okay, welcome everyone. I want to start off with a quotation. I suppose many of you may have a pet, a dog or a cat, or many dogs or many cats, or a mix of all of these types of pets at home. So I think today's talk will probably resonate with different characteristics that you might share with some of the cultures that we'll talk about in antiquity today. Did they treat their animals the same way we do? We'll explore some of those aspects today. So I'll start with this quotation. This is from Anatole France, who's a French poet and author. He lived from 1844 to 1924 and won the Nobel Prize of Literature in 1921. And he was considered in his day an ideal man, the French letters, brilliant, insightful, graceful, luminary. And he says, until one has loved an animal, a part of one's soul remains unawakened. And I think perhaps this quotation captures things about the past and the present and the future, and that there's something so transcendent about these words that they kind of span time and space, perhaps. So we'll explore some of this today to see to what degree animals, and particularly pet animals, captured that part of one's soul in Greek antiquity and Roman antiquity. So certainly animals have a link to our emotions, as many of us with pets today care for some of these animals, perhaps more than they do their own human loved ones. And certainly emotions are integral to bring out identity and a reflection of who people and cultures are. So animals certainly tell us a lot about us. And as archaeologists or people who are exploring classical antiquity, we want to know about those past cultures. So we want to explore every aspect about everything from the past, including the animals that can tell us about those people. So I'll start with this notion of what is a pet. And certainly this gives us a foundation when we explore things. So a pet really presupposes some degree of emotion or care, or connection, sort of some bonding that a human has with an animal. So simply naming an animal might be argued that that's a concept of humanizing it, giving it an identity, a character, and maybe even some humanistic type traits within that. Oh, this is stubborn, this is loving, this is helpful. And we do have in antiquity aspects of people naming animals. So we might regard that as a pet type characteristic. And we memorialize, venerate, love our pets. And certainly we can record those events. And in antiquity, they did as well, with different stories about the pets, the animals that they had. But certainly we have to be careful that some of our notions of what we think of a pet today do correlate in antiquity, but not always neatly or uniformly or exactly. So our ideas about pets today don't transfer neatly across different cultures today or in the past. So we have to be cautious when we do some of this exploration of maybe extrapolating too much out of things. Nonetheless, let's look at some of these things, and we'll start with dogs, although I'm not saying that dogs are a better pet overall. Certainly we have more information, as we'll see today, about dogs in Greek and Roman life overall. So we'll start first with just something briefly about the domestication, how dogs became domesticated. Well, they started off, and back in the Neolithic time, so 10, 11, 12,000 BC, we get sort of the first domestication events of crops and animals, and wolves becoming domesticated into dogs were one of those first steps. A lot of different hypotheses about how this happened. Probably the more predominant one is that wolves, was people started to settle down from domestication. They threw out a lot of garbage around their houses. Animals were attracted to that, wolves being some of those animals. And people started to probably initially shoo the wolves away, but couldn't keep up with that. And eventually they started to domesticate and tame those wolves as the wolves were coming around and eating the garbage around people's households. So humans developed a bond with those wolves, domesticated them into dogs. And that's where we start off the whole connection with humans and dogs overall. In Greek and Roman antiquity, which we'll focus with today, dogs weren't normally consumed. We do get some Greek contexts where dogs were eaten, but they weren't specially bred for their meat like we get sheep and goats and chickens and pigs in antiquity, which were the more popular meats. The ancient sources do discuss lots of other roles of dogs, some hunting dogs, guard dogs, shepherd dogs, dogs that pulled little carts, dogs that were performing dogs or fighting dogs or show dogs, or pet dogs is something that we'll explore more today. So among all those different roles, hunting and pets are two of the ones that we see most predominant in our sources, in our imagery, the iconography, and also in the ancient texts that talk about stories or tales or care of different animals overall. So hunting and pets are the two chief domains. And really what those two things showcase to a certain degree are not only important roles, those were predominant things, but they're popular with people, hunting and pet keeping. And both of these things really have can display identity about people and also be showcasing people. You can brag or say, I have the best pet or the best hunting dog. So they kind of are a mark of social status to a certain degree. And certainly, especially in Roman antiquity, social status was advertised and you wanted to brag and show and display it however you could. So hence these two, pets and hunting, become kind of attached with social markers and become then more predominant in our sources overall. So dogs become attached to some degree with an elevation of status, a marker of an identity. And dogs then develop a lot of symbolism attached with this as well, that dogs with power or strength or fidelity or devotion. I don't know how dogs are, are some degree a part of our family in our world today. So in antiquity, humans elevate the status to a certain degree, humanize some of these dogs in particular, and we see then those dogs in some cases even being companions in life and in death, dogs getting different burials, dogs being sacrificed, dogs being a companion to see people into the afterlife, the devoted dog who's there for you in life and devoted into death. So certainly that strong emotional bond to display, to brag, to discuss, to compete, to show off becomes attached with dogs, both in life and in some aspects, even taking those people into death as well. So once dogs get this sort of elevated status with certain components in antiquity, we see them attached as a potential kind of social marker, identity marker. And then the Romans in particular were ones who manipulated the different breeds of dogs, the variety, to get ones that kind of were unique or different than the normal types that are there. So we see them breeding taller ones, stronger ones, faster ones, cuter ones, ones with long bodies and curly tails, ones with short snouts, ones that were more ferocious, ones that needed to be coddled and cared for. So you can see that the variety in those breeds could be used as a marker for people in show and status overall, kind of the best in show type of relationship. And to see how the Romans manipulated dogs, the early Neolithic, when we saw that this time where dogs were domesticated from wolves, the size range, which is just called the Wither's height, it's just how people can look at the size of a dog overall, how tall it is. In the Neolithic and Bronze Age, it's 35 to 55 is the sort of the normal range, kind of mid-sized type dogs. In the Iron Age, which comes afterwards, as we're moving through Greek antiquity, they start to develop and breed more bigger dogs. So they're important for power, for as a good shepherd dog, so work purpose type dogs. A guard dog was important. So those breeds get manipulated to suit the needs. And in the Roman times, you see they breed some bigger ones too. It's important to get big, heavy dogs for different specialized purposes. But you see on the other end of the scale, the smaller ones start to be bred more predominantly. So those are the small toy breeds. which really don't have much purpose. You know, they're not a good guard dog, although I suppose they could bark. They're not that powerful, but they're ones that people will certainly commandeer to become pets. And they're the ones that the Romans really breed more of, or at least push that size range down to those smaller breeds overall. So the Romans had something special connection with those smaller toy breeds of dogs in particular, and spent more time and investment to move them around the Roman world, or for rich Roman people to acquire a small dog to show off. So among that range, then, we see the Romans in particular pushing things at both ends, the small dogs and the big dogs, to mark off different sort of identity markers or status for people, or purposes of use of those dogs overall. The small toy breed ones, the little pet ones, are ones that to some degree would need human care, or the ones that are the most devoted and loving, the ones that people want to carry around in their handbag to show off to people. Well, some of those early toy breed ones were around and bred in Greek antiquity. So 5th century BC, we see some depictions on various vases, some descriptions of these small little toy breeds in the ancient sources. They were the pets extraordinaire, small ones. And yes, in a Greek antiquity, we see some depictions of ones that look sort of kind of like these small little Pomeranian type ones, Spitz type dogs with, you know, longer type hair, prickly, pointy ears, and kind of a short little snout to a certain degree. That type gets a name, this Melton miniature, and it kind of gets morphed. Some of these names get sort of mixed around, that we want to attach this as a Maltese type breed. That's not particularly, the connection isn't secure with that, but that name may have some sort of connection with Maltese later on, although most likely the Maltese small toy breed dog that kind of looks similar to these ones, but is a little bit different, gets its name from Malta as a trading island, a depot of movement of some of these breeds of dogs, not just dogs, but all sorts of things might have been moved and shipped from Malta as a breeding depot, a place, a junction point where things were shipped around the Mediterranean, some of which may have been, some of these small breeds were moved in and out through that junction point. Regardless, certainly we see small breeds proliferate more in Roman antiquity. So kind of the ultimate list, it was you weren't I shouldn't say that you weren't a good Roman citizen if you didn't have a small breed, but certainly there's a advertisement marker for some of the elite Romans in particular to have a small toy breed, just like we get people in Hollywood or starlets elsewhere who carry their dogs around with them. You know, they do it probably to a great degree because they want to advertise and make themselves look special and different. Same thing was there for Roman antiquity too. They would dote on those dogs. In some cases, we get tombstones, we get stories about how people cared for their dogs, their little toy dogs. It was part of the family and gave them special care in both life and death. And certainly we can see more attention being devoted to some of those smaller breeds of dogs because they become greater investments for people in terms of social status, and particularly for the elite, rich Roman people overall. So we do see some of these small dogs being connected in terms of imagery with children as well. There's a few reasons that this may be there. Some say that, well, certainly the child in this case mimics the adult. So I could have a big dog with a big person in some iconographic imagery, but a big dog with a small child would look out of place. The scale would be off. So big person, you know, adult with bigger dog, child with smaller dog, or toy dog in this case. We might get that connection. Others say, well, children are cute, or at least some children are cute, and toy dogs, small breeds of dogs are cute as well. So we got cute and cute being connected. And others say, well, certainly just in the register, how they kind of want to put the scale for some of these images, so that it can't have a A big, huge dog would look awkward. It would look like a giant next to the child in terms of scale. So we want to scale things properly. Nonetheless, we still get certainly this idea of, I think, this cuteness of the young dog and the cuteness of the child are kind of strong parallels. And certainly we know how people will want to dote more attention on cute things overall. So we can certainly see how the small toy breeds in Roman antiquity become elevated as an important status symbol. How they might treat them. Well, certainly we have some veterinary writers in the past, or Roman and Greek antiquity, talk about vet care of animals overall. So they talk more about livestock animals, how to treat and cure horses of diseases, how to make sure that your livestock of cattle are kept well and bred well. They don't talk too much specifically about dogs or cats for that matter. So we can kind of turn to the archaeological evidence, the skeletal evidence, and look to see if there's traumatic injuries. Do I have broken bones on the dogs that I find in the archaeological record? Where might the breaks and the trauma be? Is it related to maltreatment of those dogs? What's going on? So when we take the base of our skeletal evidence from different dogs we find on archaeological sites, yes, the more common types of ailments that happen are broken bones and a lot of dental troubles, but those are common across lots of animals overall. So it doesn't tell us that dogs themselves were particularly better treated or worse treated than other animals overall. These are just common things that happen often with old age or with just, you know, activity, or dog falls or trips or those sort of things that other animals can go through. However, kind of curiously, when we look at how many of these sort of broken bones and things are there, domestic dogs seem to have more of these traumatic pathological types of ailments than wild wolves would have. So we might think that domestication and bringing these dogs into the human world might have some connection with them being a little bit more prone to injuries, we'll say. And some of those injuries could be, okay, humans are making these dogs do things they shouldn't do, certainly one thing. And the other angle of that is, well, humans are maltreating these dogs. They're kicking them in the face, they're kicking them in the ribs. Well, perhaps, but the way some of these injuries are on these dogs don't tie up with maltreatment of those dogs. So it doesn't look like the humans are being really mean to these dogs. Not to say that I'm sure there were cases where they were kicking them and doing bad things that way, but this isn't a predominant type of thing. So probably more often there's good treatment of dogs, even if the dog is not your favorite pet. When we look at kind of across the size ranges with dogs, more skeletal pathologies happen with the smaller breeds of dogs. So small ones are more susceptible to injury and illness, but those ones are also the dogs we'll see that get specialized care and treatment overall. So the smaller the dog, the more it's kind of be showcased around, the more energy it might have, the more it might get into trouble around the house, the more dental troubles it has, all sorts of things can happen because of that smaller breed. But on the flip side, those smaller breeds are the ones that get more attention. And you've heard me talk about this little toy dog from this cemetery at Carthage. This is Roman North Africa, Tunisia. Carthage is the capital of Roman North Africa. We've got this one dog that was in a burial of a 3rd, 4th century grave. This dog was put into this human burial ground in its own grave by itself. So it got special treatment overall. It was a humanized and even better, you know, it got better grave goods than some of the other humans in this burial ground. So even more special attention. But in terms of its care and pathology, well, it had an array of things here: dental loss, abscess, calculus, arthritis, hip dislocation, osteoporosis, you know, so anything that can go wrong with your skeletal and dental system, this dog had, but it lived to a ripe old age. It had kind of no teeth. It would only be gumming its food, and certainly one thing about it would have to have the ultimate of human care to survive to the ripe old age that it did with all of these skeletal ailments. So it's kind of this case study of the super attention and super care that went into a toy breed of dog at this um, site in Carthage in antiquity. How people today may care for their pets and go overboard. Well, we've got a case study of perhaps the same kind of attention overall in this Yasmina dog, this dog from the cemetery. Okay, let's flip to cats. Certainly cats were domesticated from wild cats or Felis sylvestris. And that happened in the Near East about 7,500 BC. So after dogs were domesticated, we get cats being domesticated as well. How they got domesticated? Well, certainly from the wild varieties, and we have the wild variety Felis sylvestris, which has different wild strains of that Felis sylvestris that are in different areas, some from Egypt, the Near East, some from Europe, some from Asia. So we've got a localized breeds of these wild cats that get domesticated in those specific places, be it the Near East, be it Egypt, be it Southeast Asia. They've got localized episodes of domestication for the cat there. And how it happened, well, we don't know all the details, but probably much kind of in the same way that wolves were coming around the houses and feeding off the garbage. Well, I might have had people settling down, have more grain storage around their house, which means more mice, which means more wild cats were attracted to the mice. And eventually, people just tolerated those cats being around, and they were a good thing because they kept the mice away from the grain. So the cats helped the humans, and the humans then helped the cats ultimately and domesticated them, made them a little bit more friendly. But cats, those who have cats know that cats can be very territorial, solitary, fiercely territorial. So they don't have the same kind of characteristics that dogs have. So in terms of dogs being more gregarious and like to be around people, dogs are easier to domesticate than cats overall. Nonetheless, once cats are in there, the domestication scheme, moving around to different places, we'll see that the Felis sylvestris libica, which is the Asian, or the African variety of wild cat that becomes domesticated, is one of the more important ones that proliferates around the wider Mediterranean and even sort of pushes later on in time to kind of become the more predominant cat that's really, or we'll say the Felis sylvestris, this Felis sylvestris libica, the African one, is the more predominant strain that's taken over Europe today, really, and really globally. That's the one that kind of the origin cat that's more valued across Western Europe and North America today. Okay, certainly we see that cats are really important in ancient Egypt. So once they're domesticated in the Near East and Egypt area around 7,500 BC, we see 4,000 BC, dynastic Egypt, the pharaohs, Tutankhamun, all of those pyramids. Cats become very connected with that overall. And even in their depictions of depicted more like the wilder type of version with maybe even larger sort of prick ears compared to some of the domestic cats we have today, which might have a little smaller type of ears overall. Anyway, how they're depicted certainly gives us that connection with their earlier wild Felis sylvestris libica ancestor. Nonetheless, Egyptians take a liking to cats. They make them more animistic. We've got Bastet, who's the cat-headed goddess of fertility. We get cats being linked more with magic and religion, and you know, they hold a special status overall. Many cat mummies. Cats were sacred type of animals, and certainly valued and protected and guarded a lot in that Egyptian culture. So the Egyptians didn't really want other people, to some degree, to have cats, and certainly guarded cats in their own world. Those who killed a cat, even if it was by accident, were sentenced to death. So sacred cats, certainly at a huge level in that way. They don't want other people to have them. These are our special things. With more trade around the Mediterranean and more influx of Greek cultural elements in Egypt, and later Roman cultural elements, we see cats kind of moving out more around the Mediterranean, more relaxation of those Egyptian controls on the cat, and into archaic and Hellenistic times in the 8th, 7th, 6th, 5th century BC, more cats proliferating around first the Greek world. And certainly we see some depictions in Greek art and some mention in the ancient Greek texts, but they're not popular pets in Greek antiquity, or are they going to be popular pets in Roman antiquity? And some of that is because, well, those cats do things on their own. Cats don't come up and lick your face all the time, or stand with you as dogs will. So cats are a little bit more, you know, as we know, individualistic. In Roman antiquity, certainly we see cats being depicted and moved around. And again, note that some of these cats, we see changes in their iconography, how they're depicted, with kind of ones that look a little bit more wildy, and then ones that might look a little bit more kind of domestic style. Nonetheless, their role in Roman antiquity was really just as a mouser, as a working animal who would keep mice away, be it in your house or your farm or wherever you are. We certainly see in the iconography and the stories, or the textual references, more common depictions of these things into the 2nd century AD. And they talk about the playfulness, the curiosity, the agility of cats that, you know, all of us can remark today if we have a cat. Oh, you know, Mouser does wonderful things, or look how agile they are. You know, certainly those sort of things mesmerize people in antiquity as well. But few cats as pets per se. As I said, their role was chiefly as a mouser. They were just sort of kept around the house to do that duty. And if they chose to, you know, connect with humans, well, even a better thing, I suppose. In the archaeological record, where we get a lot of things about dogs, because dogs were buried, or dogs, there are more of them, or they got special treatment. That's not so much the case in in both Greek and Roman antiquity in terms of the skeletal evidence we have. They're really minor finds. We get them maybe across all of the bones we have, you know, 0.0 or 0.1%. So think of 99.9% of the bones we find are not cats, and 0.1% are cats. That's a small type of proportion. Probably to some degree, there are fewer of them around, number one. And also, when cats, you know, are independent and solitary, and often when they are at the end of life, they go and hide to die. So they're not going to be dying on your lap in some cases, where you might honor and venerate them and give them a special burial like you would a dog, or a pet dog that you had in Greek and Roman antiquity. And our texts also don't give specific notions about how to care for a cat, how to treat it. Texts give more evidence about dogs. And if they're not doing this about cats, well, we can probably rest assured that Greek and Romans weren't at a different care system for cats overall. That said, we do get one particularly special site at the site of Berenike. It's in the South Red Sea coast here of Egypt. It's a 1st, 2nd century CE site, a Romanized site in Egypt. So certainly some of those early Egyptian influences about cats and cats being valuable might, hang on as they do in other areas of Egypt and through Roman times. And this site is an important port city. It's had lots of trade. Well, unlike the Suez Canal, which is blocked right now by a big ship, we had certainly movement of things around the Red Sea area for trade. And a lot of it sort of traded into the inland and then up the Nile. And then they could move things up that way. So park here, move things inland and go up the Nile to trade stuff. Regardless, Bernice is an important kind of cosmopolitan city with lots of Romanized influence, wealth, you name it, military, civilians, all sorts of individuals and about. And we've got one particular cemetery at Berenice for this across the larger world of antiquity. It's a Romanized site, which has a cemetery where there's an array of different animals within it. Dogs and cats are in this, but predominantly cats. And a Polish excavation team excavated at this site. They've said there's perhaps more than 300, 400, 500, 600 animals which are there overall, but they recovered 86 cat skeletons, that were some from a third adults, third from subadults, a third of them juveniles, and in some cases there are even double burials of maybe a mother cat, we'll say, with her younger baby cat. So you can see sort of a connection or tie that could be within even a family of cats here. It looks like it's a homogeneous type of population. So these are probably all local cats. These aren't cats that have been moved from different places here. Most are free of different pathologies, and there's no indication that there's an intentional kill of these. They haven't been snapped their necks or anything like that. So it looks like it's perhaps sort of this special ritualized type of cult area where I've got a special pet cemetery, really, in this case, a cat cemetery. And certainly probably some of those ideas about the cat being sacred in Egypt overall, even if we're into Roman times where cats were less sacred in Roman times than they were in dynastic Egyptian times, there's still kind of this hangover, perhaps, of a specialized nature of cats in this particular part of the world of antiquity. So certainly a different way to venerate and keep them in both life and, in this case, in death overall. So to close up, I hope this just gives you sort of a brief overview of some ideas about pet cats and dogs in antiquity. And I think a big takeaway, I hope, is that some of these emotional connections that register for some of us today with pet dogs and cats were there in antiquity. They might take a different flavor, a different element, but I think it's important certainly to link up those ideas of how the present and the past are connected. So really the past is the key to the present and the present is the key to the past. So I think ultimately what this does is make us more cognizant of classics. Discipline of looking at Greek and Roman antiquity is vital and instrumental. It's an important discipline to study for not only in its own right, but for the connection that it has with the world of today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael, for a great talk. I really appreciate the, your end comments there are a great way for us to end our series. Of course, I didn't ask Michael to say that. A good way to end our series, which is all about the intersection of the past and present, and especially new ways of looking at the past and the ancient world broadly. And for those, who are outside of Winnipeg or don't know Professor MacKinnon's work, he's definitely one of these people who is bringing new perspectives on this, new methods, and sort of bringing, a different set of skills and perspectives to classical antiquity. And we're always very glad to hear from him. It gives us some new food for thought. Also, thank you, Michael. I think what we need March 26th, 1 year and 2 weeks into the pandemic, is a presentation with a lot of pictures of cute cats and dogs. So I'm sure everyone appreciated that. Of course. I see there's some questions coming into the Q&A at the bottom. So I'll encourage you, if you want, to hit that Q&A button and enter your question, and we'll turn to them in a moment. But while you're kind of, processing the information from the talk and maybe just thinking about those, cute animals and your own emotional connections with your pets, or maybe shuffling your pet off your keyboard so that you can type. That's always a problem as well. I might ask a couple of questions to get us started. So near the beginning of your talk, you mentioned, Michael, there was that there's no or little evidence of consumption of dogs in ancient Greece and Rome. I just wondered if there is any evidence, or if you have any thoughts about the question of dogs and cats as sacrificial animals. Do we see them, or because they're not consumed, they don't become sacrificial animals?
We do. There's consumption of dogs. Some of the ancient authors talk about it. We see it's not the well. I'll backtrack a bit. An animal that's carnivorous doesn't taste very good, its meat overall. So some of this might be certainly, once we get into animals that are herbivores, they taste better, and then that just sort of proliferates more. That said, certainly there was consumption of dogs in antiquity, in Greek antiquity, and more of that sort of, but we don't see a kind of a specialized breeding of dogs for their meat. So it's more kind of not so much piecemeal, but certainly not on par with how they would breed cattle, sheep, goats, to get kind of different varieties of them, and also to kind of manipulate the demography of the animals. So if we want to get animals that are bred particularly for their meat, we might find ways to get a lot of young animals and then kill them off. So we don't sort of see that same, I'm going to get a lot of puppies and I'm going to get these smaller dogs and I'm going to eat them and then breed more, manipulate the breeding schedules of the dogs themselves to correlate with the demand for dog meat. That said, certainly there was consumption of them, and they do get linked up with a lot of ritual things of, let me put these in Athens, there's a well deposit that has lots of puppies and dogs thrown into it. So we get sort of these connections of dogs with purification, often is sort of that connection. So ritualized dumping of a lot of dogs, or ritualized dumping, connection with dogs with health. So some of these more specialized types of sacrificial deposits that show kind of that tie with a dog as a ritual special thing. Now, whether or not they took a little piece of it and ate it and did some kind of consumption is a whole other story. Certainly some of these ritual behaviors, as we know, are strange, and they don't leave any kind of good, sensible archaeological clues with them. And the Romans do talk about dog eating, but only under duress. So the Romans were ones who shied away from eating dogs and horses as well, because they were sort of special animals. And certainly those are the ones that are going to get named more. And often there's sort of this idea that if I name something, I'm more hesitant to eat it because it's got qualities that humanize it.
Okay, thank you. And maybe just one other question, then we can turn to Ruth or to the Q&A, which I see is filling up. I was wondering if there's you talked about some evidence for some damage to dog skeletons, so we can sort of in care and so on. And I just wondered if you or other people have been able to determine whether there's specific indications of injuries from something like dog fighting. I mean, was dog fighting something that's happening in Greek and Roman antiquity?
Peter, you took my question. Literally.
Okay, well, I'll answer it again. I'll answer this for Ruth then.
Yeah, better.
Yeah, there was dog fighting. Certainly we hear about, in same way they had sort of roosters fighting, dog fighting, some of these things were just important kind of sporting events in antiquity. For injuries, dog fighting, we certainly get we expect more facial type of things of bites and cuts. And there are some cases where some of the crania of the dogs, or around the jaws, have sort of these sort of penetration marks or different sort of nicks on them that could be because the dog was fighting. However, it's tough to pinpoint that as the exact cause.
Mhm.
This could be, oh, this dog got into a fight with another animal for not because the humans made them fight, but for some other reason. And certainly some of these things are the etiology, or to get at the cause of the illnesses. There are multiple things that are there. I suppose what one should do is do more specialized studies on the kind of the depth, the puncture marks, all these other things that could tie it in with the type of, you know, canine or the pokey tooth that got in there. So certainly there's some more specialized studies that could be done, but our database of the dogs that have these types of things is so small to begin with that kind of a study of 2 marks on 2 dogs spread over 2,000 years in 2 different places can't really give strong ideas of a demarcated trend, or that dogs were fighting other dogs, and it was a big important thing. But it's, yeah, there's certainly, I think, a lot more potential with that pathological stuff, if only our database was bigger, to draw out some kind of more sound conclusions with it.
Thank you. Ruth, do you have another question? I apologize for taking
that was my question. No, I just think that it was interesting for you to say and talk about Berenike having the 86 cat skeletons. That's quite interesting to find such a collection of cats, and it makes you wonder what was going on and what the thought process was in that area for keeping them together. I mean, sure, they could be wild, or they could be, you know, it could be something that just was of real value to the community. So I found that very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I don't have any other question right now, but I'm going to listen to the rest.
That Berenike one, and bear in mind, I wasn't the archaeologist who dug that. I don't have all the firsthand information of what's there with it, but certainly it is one of these really unique type of things. There's no other place that I know of. You know, so we have a few cases of kind of dog burials in cemeteries. In some cases, there's some, you know, early Neolithic ones or Bronze Age ones, like Ashkelon, or these places where I get, you know, multiple dogs, hundreds of dogs in a cemetery, but nothing where cats are there. And even across the cemetery context that I know in the Roman world, I don't know of a case where a cat is put in with at the foot of a human, let alone a cat in its own grave in a human cemetery. So cats don't get that same sort of treatment, so that making that Berenike example even more unique overall.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Not only its numbers, but in the treatment of some of those animals in that cemetery, who had some had collars and other things, little bells and stuff, that sort of, you've got a collar around the animal's neck, then it's a greater sign of human investment or domestication or attention.
It might make you wonder if they have the same, in that community, have the same idea along with the dogs, where it's showcasing and they're used as a marker and their sense of identity, even with their collars and bells. It just makes you, you know, wonder what was going on in that area. So with the cats.
Yeah, if we had a time machine, it'd be helpful.
Yeah.
But yeah, certainly it's well, I can always come back to, you know, what people wouldn't do for their pets today in some cases. Some of those things are displayed in the past. Did they do it for the same reasons that we do it today? Who knows? You know, you could go on and on about all this type of stuff, but I think just kind of that connection of people went out of their way or did unique, weird things or special things ties up us today with those in the past. So the more things change, the more they stayed the same. We get sort of these ideas of certainly investment to understand those is critical to understand human culture globally, past, present. You know, it's all a detective story.
Absolutely.
Well, maybe we'll turn to some questions, because I think we have something like 17 questions that have popped up in the Q&A already. So I'm just going to take these first two that I see in the chat first, and then I'll switch over to the Q&A. So I do see the questions. Our first question's from Debbie Sneed. She writes, sorry if you discussed this and I missed it, but I've heard about puppies being buried with children. Does this bear out in the archaeological evidence as a widespread practice? And if so, do you know why?
Yes, and one site I worked at in Italy, the site of Lugnano, is a late antique burial where we've got an infant cemetery, and that's a case where there were puppies that were sacrificed with the babies in this infant cemetery. And there's this connection in that case. People make, and there are other cases where I see some puppies with human burials or children or infants, but this Lugnano is one of these ones where it was a large infant cemetery with a large group of puppies in it. So it's one of these more kind of showcased examples. And most likely it's because these puppies are connected with the goddess Hecate, who's important to see the children into the afterlife. So she's the goddess who would protect them into the afterlife. And since children were kind of it was tragic when they died in some cases, and there was these unnamed entities, some kids didn't get a name until they were 3-4 years old. So you've got an unnamed thing that died. We don't want it to haunt the living, so we have to make sure we sacrifice to Hecate to make sure that the spirit of the baby doesn't come and haunt the living. So certainly appropriate rituals. Well, rituals underlie a lot of behavior in antiquity, and some of these rituals may seem odd or strange to us, but back then they weren't, and they had a purpose. So sacrificing some of these little dogs or puppies, in this case, which might have been more expendable, put them in with the babies. It could be, I take puppies because puppies are young and babies are young. Certainly there might be other layers of connection that are there, but I think the overall thing is they're there to ensure the safe passage of this baby to the afterlife. So it does happen.
That sort of connects with our next question from Sheila Miller, also known as my mom. Apart from the Egyptians, so I mean, you mentioned Hecate. Are there other gods in Greek and Roman culture that we see connected with dogs and cats?
Yeah, more so certainly within in the Egyptian stuff, and I'm not an Egyptologist, so I don't know all of the ins and outs of all the dynastic and pharaonic Egyptian things. But yeah, there's lots. Certainly, Egyptian religion is animistic, which has lots of Anubis, or the jackal-headed gods, or the Horus. So certainly there's a lot of that connection with animal imagery in Egyptian religion, which I don't have all the foundation with that. When we look at Greek and Roman antiquity, yeah, we get connections of certainly the gods and goddesses there become more personified. They're humans looking type of things, but they do get connections of animals attached with them. Look at Cerberus, the three-headed dog of the underworld. We get some gods and goddesses who demand sacrifice of different types of animals. Hecate is really the one who gets more of the dogs connected with her. Beyond that, I don't know if like Zeus and Hera, or the big gods that we know of from the Olympian gods, well, these dog and a cat animal attached with them. We get Ares sometimes gets dogs with him, but Zeus doesn't really seem to have a pet dog at his side. Hera doesn't have a pet cat. We get Aphrodite with some pet birds, but the dog and the cat don't seem to be attached as strongly in the Greek and Roman world with the god or goddess that's there.
Okay.
Just those more specific cases of them being used for a ritual purpose, for a sacrifice. We do get, there are festivals of the Robigalia, these other type of festivals where, a dog has to be sacrificed for this purpose or this purpose. But a lot of those is not, Zeus demanded that the dog was there because Zeus kept the dog at his foot and he loved his pet dog. There's not sort of that same kind of connection.
Okay, that's great. I'm going to move on to the Q&A. I think you can see it on your screen as well, Michael, if you, there's a Q&A button at the bottom. If you want, I'll read them aloud, but then you've got them there for reference. So the first question in the Q&A is from Martin Seelig. Would there have been special dog breeders as there are today in antiquity? Would any of those breeds of dogs or cats be recognizable amongst today's breeds? And you sort of touched a little bit on that with that cat, that sort of tabby cat near the end. And what were the fighting dogs used by the Romans?
Dog special breeders. Yeah, I think it's difficult to sort of pinpoint that a special role that gets written up a lot of so-and-so I go to as a special breeder. Certainly we see the evidence of special breeding that goes into play. We've got Roman farming manuals that talk about breeds of, of animals. We've got different hunting manuals that talk about how to do hunting. And certainly from the range of the different kinds of qualities they want in those animals. And if you look at, I want a hunting animal to, go fast or to have a good sense of smell. Those imply that there is some sort of market out there for people to dabble around in breeding. Whether or not there's not a long list of, on my tombstone, I'm getting a thing saying, I'm the famous dog breeder who's you go to on the Cesar Romero, whomever the dog whisperer type of individual. I don't know of direct references that way. Breed. Certainly there's a lot of competition in antiquity, so they would know, and certainly the better breeders were probably the ones who were more successful in that regard. Are those breeds recognizable from today's breeds? Well, it's hard. Although I talk about breeds in antiquity, I perhaps should call them varieties rather than breeds. Breeds is a modern term that talks about genetic qualities of this gene mixed with that gene and all that other stuff, type of stuff that modern breeders do today by genetic mixing. Romans mixed animals and could pick out traits. They knew that if I get big animal, I'm going to get maybe a big baby from that animal. They knew about that kind of stuff, but didn't know all the genetics behind it, obviously. So yes, I think some of our modern breeds really have antecedents in some of these earlier ones, but until we do more genetic kind of connections of all these, we won't know exactly the transition lines genetically for this stuff. They are doing a lot of DNA work with dogs and have all these different trees and things that show this came from this and this and that. And that's kind of, when they get more advanced with that, we'll certainly see at what point kind of a breed as we know it today arose in its evolutionary sense and how far back that might get to antiquity. But some of there's more murky ground to say modern breeds are the same as the ones that are there in antiquity, because there's so much kind of manipulation through time as it goes. And until we get the genetic sequence, it's hard to say, yep, that dachshund that I have today is the same as the dachshund that's there from, Caesar's time.
I guess it shows us that, of course, these are the new methods, like I've said about your own work, Michael, but these kind of methods we need people to bring to bear and continue to bring to bear, and people are doing it on classical antiquity to get some of these answers. Yeah. Sticking with skeletal remains, our next question comes from Kenneth Kitchell. He's interested in pariah or street dogs in Athens and wonders if you're aware of zooarchaeological studies on the bones of dogs to determine their diets. Was the pampered pet's diet shown to be superior to that of street dogs?
Yeah, studies about the diet of the animals. They're doing a lot of more isotopic work where they, the expression "you are what you eat" is really true, that some of these signatures of what we get from the landscape, where you are, what types of plant resources, or how much your diet is kind of meat-based or plant-based. We can tell from looking at different carbon and nitrogen and different strontium, different chemical compounds that leave a signature in your bones and in your teeth. And yeah, they're doing a lot more of that. This has kind of ballooned a lot in the last decade or so, where we're looking at individual diets of animals and how that might be culturally connected. So, and how people may even think with livestock, I'm going to manipulate this pig, give it a special diet so its pork tastes better. And kind of some of those ideas. But with dogs, I've done some isotopic work on remember that little toy dog, the one from Carthage with all the skeletal troubles? Its isotopic signature in terms of nitrogen, so which is kind of a thing which, not neatly, but we'll say it correlates more with the higher your nitrogen value, the more meat-based your diet would be. It's not that simplistic, but certainly we'll use it as a guide in this case. And that little dog from Yasmina, that little tiny Carthage example, plots the highest level on the nitrogen scale of any other dog that I know of from all the parallels. So that special dog may have gotten the specialized diet, which was high in certainly meat and probably ground up meat resources. So yeah, they're going to manipulate it. Well, here's a case where a cherished dog, as that Yasmino one looks to be, got the high quality Alpo dog food that was pure meat, ground up, not this meat with some, grain byproducts and all this other stuff which a dog doesn't really want. Dogs want ground up pure meat. That's the special stuff. It's expensive, but if you're going to care for a dog, and especially a dog that Yasmina one had no teeth, give it ground up stuff that it's just going to munch down on and love. So I think more of these isotopic studies are going to show how dogs were fed, and certainly then that gives us an idea of, okay, the street dog is going to it's rummaging garbage and not getting the right stuff, or getting too much an array of different things versus the household dog, which might have a specialized thing, or pure meat, if you're rich and influential enough.
It makes me think, Michael, of my toothless old cat, who gets very, very high quality food, better quality food than I eat, I think.
Yeah, it's true. Rob, I'm not advocating, but you should all taste dog food at some point to see.
We may have a connection.
Oh,
there we go. You froze for just a moment, but you're back, Michael.
Oh, yeah, just sorry.
That's okay. So we'll go into the next question from Kate Robbie. She asks what you think of the cat burial with a man on Cyprus from around 7000 BCE. Perhaps you know of that fine. And she also adds that she's also always confused by the Egyptians breeding thousands of cats to be mummified and at the same time venerating them. So if you have further comments, I guess. I know you're not an Egyptologist, but.
I'm not an Egyptologist, and certainly the things that veer more into the prehistoric stuff, like the Cyprus example, I don't know all the details with it as well. Certainly, I think that early context really goes at the foot of the domestication of the cat around the Near Eastern area. They were, and we can get independent areas where it's sort of domesticated across the Near East and into Egypt overall at that time. So that case, I don't know all the details with it, but certainly anytime you're going to get an animal in a grave with a human, I think either is some weird ritual type of thing. And if I don't have textual evidence saying, like in the case of put those puppies with those children for this purpose, if I don't have a similar kind of playbook of why to do that, probably the explanation I would gravitate to is, well, that animal had some emotional connection with that individual. That seems to be the, I said, that seems to be more probable, we'll say, because why would one go through an effort of putting it in? And obviously, we don't know that the grave goods are always done by the people afterwards. It's not this guy put in his will, I want to go with Fluffy the cat and put Fluffy the cat in the grave with me afterwards. So certainly it could be the attendants afterwards putting this cat in for a certain emotional bond or a particular reason or command or some sort of attachment that that individual had. That seems to be, in my case, the sort of a more probabilistic type of explanation. As I said, I don't know all the details with it overall because I'm not a prehistorian on that context, but certainly in Greek and Roman antiquity, when that happens, that tends to be, if it's a specialized animal in a grave, then there's got to be some likely emotional connection that was there for that individual. If I can rule out that it's not this ritual specialized demand of putting it in for this particular, sacrificial region or reason. Lots of cats. Again, I'm not an Egyptologist. I apologize. Yeah, breed lots of cats, mummify at the same time. I don't know. Certainly, cats were tied deeply in Egyptian culture. So I can see them casting the net wide to let's get lots of them. Let's do as much as we can with them. And let's advertise a lot of this as well. So certainly mummification, breeding, all of these things are just ways to I guess, make it, display it, we'll say, more prominently across multiple lines of human culture. So when people want it, you want to be special as a culture, you do things that others can see and know, and that others within your culture know you're doing it for these reasons. So I think cats just filled that niche, and we could do lots of things with cats in both life and death, breed them, mummify them, do things that might seem a little bit more callous with them, but ultimately are ways of showcasing that we've got that control of them and we can popularize it as we like.
Right. Okay, I'm gonna move on. I'm gonna speak as little as possible because we've got a bunch of questions still to go. So our next question is from Nazia Makaruna. She asks about the small dogs in the vase paintings and on funerary stelae, I guess. Could these small dogs be that are depicted with children be puppies? So do we have a kind of correlation of young and young, or it's just small and young?
Could be, yes, but you know that in some of those cases it's the variety, I won't say breed because I'm not supposed to say that for antiquity, the variety of dog that's there is depicted as a small toy breed or an adult small toy breed. So that idea of this is the puppy version of that breed, that connection doesn't seem to be there, at least explicitly in the iconographic evidence. But yeah, I think a lot of cases that more likely the puppy version of the dog, even if it was the sheepdog, and this is the puppy version of that sheepdog, certainly children are going to be connected more with puppies, regardless. All humans are connected to puppies. Puppies, that cuteness scale or something that draws you in.
Yeah, I like this. I think you're right. There's a universal cuteness to puppies. We can't get away from, even ardent cat lovers like me. Our next question is well, not from our colleague Warren, but from his partner Julie. For skeletal remains of dogs, does it look as though the injuries were treated, or were they left to heal on their own, or does it look as though the dog was killed after the injury and then replaced with another?
Yeah, interesting question. The injury stuff, although there was a capability in Greco-Roman antiquity for splinting broken bones, the army goes through this, and they talk about got doctors who have techniques to cure all sorts of ailments and illnesses and traumatic things in humans. That capability exists for animals too, and certainly we see some of it shown with kind of a well-set injury on different livestock, in particular, especially more prized livestock. Dogs, no, we of the broken bones that I've seen, none seems to be splinted. We don't have definitive evidence that there's been a splint put on that broken bone. because some of the ways that those bones have healed, it's, you know, it's a green stick fracture, a broken thing where it's severely malaligned afterwards. So certainly it hadn't been set, but then the dog still recovered from it and lived a long life afterwards. So there isn't so much, I guess in that case, the idea of the animal broke its bone, therefore I must kill it and get rid of it and bring a new one in. Certainly there's some cases where that animal recovered, not because it was splinted, but because it recovered, and it could be, you know, they kept it, they cared for it, they nurtured it, they did some extra things to treat it, to keep it. So, you know, but the bone healed without sort of surgical or operations. We do get some bones like in the paws and other stuff. That's probably an area where more dogs have troubles, you know, broken bones and fingers. And the way your hand is, there's sort of a natural splinting to it. So some of the broken bones in the paws of the animals, because the bone, the other finger or the paw is next to it, provides sort of a natural type of splint. So those seem to be less malaligned, we'll say. But yeah, the capability existed to splint these things, and the vets are there, you know, their vets are, you know, all doctors were kind of lower order citizens overall, or, you know, slaves in that case. So to be a vet in antiquity wasn't a prominent job.
Great, thank you. Our next question is a little more subjective for you from our classics student at Winnipeg, Marina Milne. She asks about the ancient evidence pertaining to dogs or cats, inscriptions, funerary contexts, its stories, etc., and wonders which piece of ancient evidence do you particularly like? So not necessarily as a zooarchaeologist, but as a generally.
Yeah, well, there's you know, the poet Marshall writes about Issa, the special dog, you know, it goes on and on about this particular one. That tombstone that I showed of the dog, and it had the inscription with Helena underneath it. Well, that's kind of one that it's from the Getty, and it's one of the more famous ones. And that one, you know, it says to Helena, it's sort of this, it says, may you have a praiseworthy soul or something along that line. To, you know, a lot of these things are just, you know, this person had a good death, and may their soul be venerated and praised in the afterlife. These kind of common type of things that get put on tombstones, that they had a good life and their death was a good quality kind of death, and how wonderful and great everything is overall. So that's, I think, the more those kind of, well, let me say that some of the, although we can't know that in that case, that image of the dog and the inscription underneath means that the dog is named Helena, and that the dog Helena got this special death and great afterlife and all those sort of things. It could be the dog was just an important marker for the person, what they wanted on their tombstone to advertise who they were, a loving pet owner, whatever. So we don't have that true connection with it. So certainly there are other cases where, you know, dogs show up, but again, it's difficult in some cases to say that we, let me rephrase, we don't have a good quality tombstone with the dog, the inscription, and then the burial of the dog underneath it, where I've got a one-to-one relationship that's there. But certainly dogs are showing up on these things, inscriptions, and dogs are talked about, and the toy ones are talked about in the text, and the playfulness and all those other things that we connect with our pets. Stories about them do show up in the ancient sources.
Great, thank you. Next question is from Stella Nikolova, who herself is a zooarchaeologist, and she remarks that she's sometimes come across disarticulated cat remains. Oh, this sounds so gruesome to me. Disarticulated cat remains from women's sites, but the only cases with a cat and a human burial date to the later medieval period, and so she's wondered if that was connected to the plague, since cats are good for rat control. and wonders if there are earlier cases before the 12th to 13th century CE. I guess we just heard about the one in Cyprus.
Yeah, I don't know if, other than that Berenike one, which is special and exceptional, I'm not aware of Roman burial places where there's a cat in the grave. And I could be mistaken. There may be some odd ones here or there, but certainly it's not a common type of thing. So certainly the idea of this isn't as the important thing that we do. In terms of cats, certainly when we move into the more Middle Ages, cats at one stage get sort of tied up with black magic and all this other stuff, which is another story of, the cat's eyes are shining and the cat's nocturnal and all these things of cats get a bad rap for superstitious stuff and through some Middle Age context. And then moving into the later Middle Ages is where the cats start to, more attention gets devoted to them to breed them, to get the different sort of varieties that up and coming and that exists for today. So certainly the later Middle Ages is that time where attention gets devoted to the cat more. Yes, probably more likely things about greater trade networks, more movement of grain shipments and all these other things where now I'm gonna put this cat on that shipment of grain and it'll act as a natural mouser so that when things arrive and the shipments for Middle Ages stuff everywhere, that the cat was just quality control to make sure that the grain gets there in a good state. And certainly more of that's going to push the cats all throughout continental Europe. And then you just get them more around and then people tune into, I want one of those things. Look, they can keep the grain free and the grain in my house will be better, so you just get a more explosion of them. And then once they're commonly in people's lives, then they become attached and immersed more. So, and that really doesn't happen until, well, at least throughout the rest of all of Europe into more Middle Ages. And certainly things about plague, yep, that's a good connection that could be there that, yep, when times are tough, people look to ways to find solutions, hence COVID-19. So it doesn't surprise me that cats are there to, whether directly or indirectly, are there in that world of the plague to keep things balanced.
Right, I'm sure it's demonstrates this kind of.
I'm not a medievalist, I'm not an Egyptologist, so I don't have all the details with it.
It's interesting. I mean, the questions coming from outside of your area of specialty, Michael, I think show us this sort of. There's like there's the continuities like you've stressed, right? These kind of universal things about animals and humans, and then there's all these very specific geographical and temporal specificities that have to be accounted for. And it shows just how complex a topic, I guess, animals in antiquity, or in antiquity in the broadest sense, are. Our next question is from Flavia Fernandez Benini, and she asks about a famous dog or cat that belonged to someone in antiquity. Do we have evidence of someone having a famous dog? I know later in the questions we have a question about Odysseus's dog, but he's not a real person.
Nobody asked me a good archaeological question. I'm not up on all the philology and the text. I apologize on that one too. Others may have a particular story about an animal. Certainly I knew more about the odder cases where we've got, the horses made as a consul, or the exotic animals that get traded around. I suppose I've explored more of those sort of the weird and wonderful case studies from the ancient texts that tie, or on the flip side, the livestock. You asked me about cows and sheep and all that other stuff. I can spill more of that because that comes up more with the zooarchaeological evidence. So I apologize, I don't have offhand a particular story about an emperor or an individual other than the kind of those case studies with the Helen Arius are the more kind of, I suppose, popularized ones in antiquity. So others may know of a particular emperor or those who are the philologists in the crew who've studied more of the texts themselves to pull out specific examples, and I will sort of defer to anyone else who can who has studied that to a greater degree. And I apologize, is that I don't have all of that offhand.
The dangers of
individual stories
interdisciplinary
each.
talks, right?
I apologize. I'm
No, there's no
only human. But certainly a lot of that you can probably just Google dogs with emperors, and I'm sure you'll get some different connections of stories or those particular things from our millions of pages of ancient texts that are out there that bring this in. But certainly it's not something offhand that there are anecdotal tales here and there, but these aren't things that are showing up commonly on every single page of every single text.
That's right. I'll just mark that Dr. Funky suggested in the chat that Alexander the Great named a city after his dog Piritas. So there we have. I mean, Alexander he named a city after everything. So he ran out of things and needed to name it after his dog, probably. But I agree. I think there's
Thank
likely.
You saved the day for me, Melissa. Next time, when an archaeology questions comes up for Melissa, I'll be ready.
All right. Well, I think we turn back here to something that's more specific, maybe with some of the evidence that can be discerned from archaeology and zooarchaeology. Returning to the question of eating dogs, and wondering if this intersects with Greek mythology at all. I'm sorry, this is a question from our colleague here, Kevin Walby. Does dog eating intersect with Greek mythology, and can you say anything at all about research on dog eating cults in Greek antiquity?
I can say a bit. Again, a lot of the dog eating stuff that happens more into the Bronze Age cultures in Greek antiquity. So we see it there. Certainly, my forte with antiquity really is from the classical times onwards, at a phase where certainly we get consumptions of dog decreases as we get more classical, Hellenistic, and Roman influence into the world of antiquity. That goes down. So certainly some of the more prevalent things with dog consumption are in those prehistoric Bronze Age cults. So the other part, where was it?
Oh, sorry. I think I sent the question away. I'll tell you in just a second. Yeah. And can you say anything at all about research on dog eating cults in antiquity? I mean, are there people working, I guess, on this now?
Yeah, there's a few, but there's a couple articles about the consumptions of dogs in antiquity. We've got a few places, like some context on Crete. They've got a couple places where some dogs have particularly, some specialized kind of marks on the skeleton. It looks like they've been, the bones have been chopped in different ways that tie up not with sort of what look like there's consumption. Sometimes you might get, I have to chop up an animal to fit it into the grave. So some cases I get horse bones that are chopped up, but that doesn't imply that that horse was consumed, but that horse had to be chopped up to move easily. In the case of dogs, well, there's no reason to chop it up unless there's some ritual behind it, or that there's some aspect of consumption with it. So some of the placements of these cuts, a chop with a nick sort of mark of a knife, certainly ties up that they've, barring any weird ritual, that the obvious hypothesis is that the animal has been consumed somehow. And then you have to look at, well, why they're consuming it. Is it ritual consumption? Is it just because they want some meat in their diet and they don't care the taste of dog versus pig or something else? Is it because the other animals weren't around? So all these other reasons about why you might do it. But that said, I think there's no strong evidence that consumption is happening outside of consumption of other animals, or exclusive of other animals, that this is a puppy factory and our cult or our culture is going to breed the heck out of these dogs and we're just going to consume dogs. There's nothing of that kind of factory farming type of notion with dog consumption across even into those Bronze Age cultures, there's none of this sort of factory farming of dogs. Whereas you get, certainly some Asian cultures, it's a whole other story where dog consumption is tied more strongly, and that dog consumption is consumption that is not so much ritualistic, but just part of their everyday meat.
Mm-hmm. Great. I think maybe we have time for one more of the questions in the Q&A. So I'll go to this question from our own student, Paige Boyd. And she says, since there are examples of dogs intertwined with Greek epics and sometimes mythology, she's thinking of Argos. I was wondering if there was a way to determine if the Greeks would have regularly held that kind of man's best friend idea about domesticated dogs. And you've kind of touched on this a little. Mm-hmm. And if they felt dogs were able to hold a level of intelligence, as it were.
Yeah, it's hard to say, but certainly I believe that emotional connection that an animal has with a human transcends time and space. And it's something that might not get written about, mm-hmm. but is there. Mm-hmm. And certainly that, there aren't stories about how to care for a pet toy breed. Do this, mm-hmm. this, and this, and this. There are a few things about, treat it well or do this, kind of more generalized types of things, but nothing that gives us that more specificity that ties it so strongly with human connection or all those sort of emotional bonds and tugs at your heartstrings and all those other things. So the man's best friend notion, I think, is subjective to a big degree. And I suspect there were cases where, there were, introverted or people in antiquity who wanted to be with animals more than humans. So then you think of how that bond, even if, okay, the notion of pet isn't developed as it is today, doesn't mean that some people in the past didn't feel it and maybe felt it stronger in some cases than people do today. So all of these things, there's so much, subjective, nuanced. We can't get it from our piecemeal sources that are there. But I think with that case with that Yasmina dog, that special little toy breed, I think sparks something that there's probably more variety to say that there's that we can't generalize when probably the world of antiquity is so disparate, so unique, so variable, and so unrecorded in a lot of cases that I bet, yeah, there were some who I think had the animals were their best friends. I wouldn't doubt it. Mm-hmm. Even if the rest of society is saying, stay away from that thing, that filthy mutt, that stuff that's unimportant, keep away, there's always going to be a sentimental bond somehow. Well, when we look at today, people get all manner of weird things that they're call a pet. A rock, a blade of grass, a lizard, anything, you name it. So I think that's transcends time and space. Probably didn't answer the question properly, but I think if it gives you this idea to pause and to rethink about what people connect with, that it could be totally unique, unexplainable, but in the same way of being unexplainable, I think it is explainable. That probably doesn't answer things properly, but think of connection is strong.
Yeah, I think it's a good, and we're just about out of time. It's a good place to end, Michael, with this sort of paradox, right, of the extreme infinite varieties of human experience and human emotional connections, and then correspondingly the little bit of evidence that we have, right? Even in places where we seem to have a lot, the little bit of evidence that we then try to generalize from, and trying to balance the general and the specific, for everyone who works on classical antiquity in any field, is one of the great challenges, to draw conclusions, but also kind of respect the specificities of each individual's experience from antiquity as much as we can. With that in mind, though, I think we will draw things to a close, and I apologize. I know there are a couple questions we didn't quite get to in the Q&A.
Just those who have the other questions, if you want to email them to me, I'm happy to try and work with them through that forum. So I apologize, but yeah, certainly I want to assist if possible.
That's great. Thank you, Michael. It's very generous. And Michael's email is m.mckinnon@uwinnipeg.ca, or if you can find it at uwinnipeg.ca/classics and go to faculty and staff and look for the big Professor Michael MacKinnon, and you'll find his email address there. Just before we bid you all a good evening or afternoon or morning, wherever you are, I'd like to just thank my co-organizer, Ruth Dickinson, for her work with the series this year. Thank my colleagues here at the University of Winnipeg who've helped organize things as well. Next year, we do plan on being back for our 5th year of New Directions in Classics. And at present time, at least, we're anticipating a return to on-campus activities at the U of W. But I will let you know, especially if you're not in Winnipeg, not in Manitoba, that we were ahead of the curve in 2019, broadcasting our lectures on the web and recording them as well. So we'll continue to do that in some fashion now that we have access to all the different type of video conferencing technology, which will presumably remain. We should be able to do it in a more sophisticated manner than we were previously. So if you'd like to keep up to date on the lectures that will be offered and when they'll be available, you can follow the University of Winnipeg on Twitter. I think it's at uwinnipeg_CLAS. You can follow us on Facebook, facebook.com/UofWClassics. You can follow us on Instagram at uwinnipegclassics. We don't have a Snapchat. We don't have a TikTok. Or you can also go to uwinnipeg.ca/classics and send me an email, and I'm happy to let you know when our new series is advertised and let you know how to access it if you're not here in Winnipeg. The recording for this lecture, if you want to revisit it or if you want to be able to bring it to someone else's attention, will be available on our YouTube channel likely on Monday afternoon. That's when I usually get to them. So with that, I'll just thank Professor MacKinnon for this wide-ranging talk demonstrative of the interdisciplinary knowledge necessary to understand animals in both their specific lives in antiquity, their connections with people, and what kind of general conclusions we can draw about the connections between humans and animals from, I suppose we dealt with from the furthest reaches back into prehistory in the Neolithic times, all the way with some of the questions up to the medieval period, and indeed to our connections with pets today. Thanks very much, Michael, and thank you everyone for tuning in.